Hi, and welcome to the Imperfect podcast. My name is Deb Crow, and I will be your host. Join me on this journey as we meet heart-centered leaders from all over the globe. Lots of interesting questions, interesting conversation, and find out what makes a leader. How do they handle uncertainty and complexity? How do they lead in a time that is volatile? Join us. Welcome back to Imperfect, the Heart-Centered Leadership podcast. One of the things that I love about social media, specifically LinkedIn, is I am meeting some incredible heart-centered leaders all over the globe. And today I'm so excited to interview Tanya Tarr. She is a behavioral scientist and a writer for Forbes, and she's also the president and founder of Cultivated Insights out of Austin, Texas. So we have so many things to cover. So Tanya, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Deb. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so glad that you reached out, and I just want to dive in because I have so many questions for you. I've had to reduce my amount of questions for 30 minutes because we have so much to talk about, but we have a lot in common. And you're a behavioral scientist, and my background's in neuroscience, pardon me. And I love that we both do workshops, we work with teams. You also use a SMART evaluation to work with C-suite leaders. So let's kind of dive in. And my first question is, I love the name of your business, Cultivated Insights. And I know that you cultivate and you also provide insights to C-suite leaders. So tell us a little bit of how that came together and the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, naming and branding is not my strong suit. And I started, like many people, doing coaching, executive coaching type stuff. And so it went through many iterations, but Cultivated Insights, a baby business. I launched it about a year and a half ago. And I think for me, cultivation, and I think this ties into heart-centered leadership, I think that there was a lot of praise of like disruption and things like that. And I think that I see the counterbalance to disruption as cultivation. I think that part of why we globally are in the space we're in right now is that people just didn't really respect time. And the business that I'm have developed, is really the collection of a lot of wisdom, both in my own learned experience, but then also with incredible leaders that I've worked with and incredible experts and scientists that I draw from when I'm designing workshops and particularly evaluation. So that's where Cultivated Insights came from. And then and it ended up spanning out into other sort of connected versions of the business. So I ended up, this is so kind of random, but a lot of what I do actually is helping people and companies and corporations understand that we're in a space where we need to be thinking about, and I'm going to use, Deb, I feel like I can use this language with you because I know we share very similar kind of intellectual backgrounds, but training is not so much about skill acquisition these days. It's actually about behavioral modification. The pandemic has completely changed the way we work. And so anyhow, not to get too much off on a tangent here, but I accidentally created a planner that and you mentioned social media, Deb. I made a planner for myself because I bought a binding machine because I like making stuff with my hands. And I made a planner, and it has like a time tracker on it. And it's the result of a kind of a rubric and a diagram that I created when I was recovering from chronic illness to track my time and keep my attention span, kind of on the mark. But anyhow, I made this thing for fun and I tweeted it. And a bunch of people said, "Oh, I'd pay money for that." And I was like, you guys are joking, right? And then I was like, as a joke, I was like, well, just Venmo me $10 and I'll send you a copy. And then I went out to dinner with my husband, and my phone started pinging while we were in the restaurant. And I was like, what is going on? And like 4 people had Venmoed me money. And I was like, oh man, you got to be kidding me. So now I had to make these planners for people and send them out. And anyhow, it just kind of mushroomed. So Cultivated Insights is the work I do with organizations. And it's mostly learning and development for teams, and also, for anyone in an organization. But Cultivated Tools are now another little spinoff, where I make kind of small batch productivity items that help people. And then the Cultivated School is the online workshops that I do, because in the last couple of years, well before we were thinking about future work kind of stuff, I started teaching negotiation skills classes via Zoom. And my students are from all over the world. And it's just been extraordinary to be able to connect with people in real time and teach them the type of collaborative skills that I think are so vital.
Well, what I didn't share with you is my background is in community-based case management, and I worked with a lot of men and women who had chronic illness. So I was literally smiling ear to ear as you're sharing, because one of my favorite cliches or metaphors is growth always comes from the valley. So here's you self-auditing, creating a compensatory strategy to track your time and move you through this illness, and look where it's brought you, and how it's now been a tool. And you're right, tools do help with behavioral modification. And what a great idea for that planner. And it's still existing today and you're still using it.
Yeah, I actually had to slow down the production aspect because, for all those reasons. But yeah, it was funny actually, Deb, when I made it. It's meant to help you with the day. It's not so much like most people want planners so they can look at a whole year, 6 months or something like that. And sorry, there's a plane going overhead. So, and I lost my train of Deb, I hope you can edit this. Sorry. I hope, if you can't, well, we'll just keep rolling. But when I made the planner, it was actually meant to track the individual days. It's not meant to encompass a calendar year. So you can write in the date. And at the time, a couple of people were like, well, you should make a calendar year. And I was like, nah, it's just for the day. And which is useful now, because it's hard to, track the weeks in the calendar year. But Helen Rosner, who writes for an incredible publication that is escaping me right now, but she's a food writer and brilliant. And she tweeted the other day that every day is the present now because of the pandemic. So it has been surprising that this tool that I created still manages to help people just keep track. And brain plasticity is, I think, important and difficult to try to achieve when you're always in sort of a state of chronic hypervigilance. You know what I mean?
Oh, 100%. And that's a really great term. I used to work with a lot of first responders, and
Mm,
how do you come home from being on a shift of anywhere from 8 to 12 hours, working at a level of hypervigilance, seeing the worst of the worst, being exposed to loss and trauma, and sit down and eat dinner with your family?
yes.
So really good point there. And just to reiterate, the name of the podcast is Imperfect. And I love that there's a plane flying over, you lose your train of thought, and we carry on with progression. So well
Oh dear.
done. Well done.
Sorry about that.
I love it. And congratulations, because I know that you were number 24 on the most influential voice on Twitter, and you were a Rising Star winner in 2009. And you've really made a significant mark, I think, with some of the work that you've done. So I want to take you back a little bit to your schooling. So I know you have your Bachelor of Science in Political Science, History, and Policy. And
Yep.
then you went on to do your Master's of Science in Performance Measurement from Carnegie Mellon University. I'd love to hear Did you decide to do a thesis or a research project? And what led you to pursue your master's?
I think I'm confident enough to be super authentic and honest with you, Deb. I was in college in the late '90s, and at Carnegie Mellon, and I actually ended up at CMU because that's where the scholarship. I got a full ride to go there, and if I didn't have a scholarship, just where I was coming from. If I didn't have a scholarship, I wasn't going to college. So that made that decision, and then late '90s. Carnegie Mellon's a technical university, and so people were graduating. My friends were graduating and moving to Silicon Valley and becoming paper millionaires almost immediately because it was the .com boom. And I was like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, so let me enroll in the master's program. And I never thought I'd be rah Carnegie Mellon, but looking back all these years, I am very much rah Carnegie Mellon because they were very much into making sure we were very interdisciplinary. It didn't matter what you were studying. So I ended up taking a lot of cognitive science and statistics. They didn't really have a political science program. So I ended up taking classes on like survey evaluation and building things to measure stuff. And then that also ended up being what I did in graduate school. And my thesis was on No Child Left Behind, which is a measurement system that the Bush administration, was it the Bush administration? Might have predated them. But I can't believe I can say this out loud. That was 20 years ago. But I looked at the way the measurement tools, the evaluation tools that the Department of Education was using to evaluate the success or failure of school districts. And performance measurement really means program evaluation. So trying to understand processes, trying to understand the human element of it. I mean, human beings are very squishy and messy, right? It's a different social science, and cognitive and behavioral sciences, slightly different than being what some people call hard scientists. I really don't appreciate those words, but someone who can go into a lab and observe things that have a very regular kind of output because they're inanimate objects versus human beings who are unique, amazing, and sometimes troublesome problem solvers, right? So I looked at the way that they were evaluating performance of schools and then apportioning resources as rewards, which, I could talk an entire hour about how that was wrong. But there's a lot, just technically speaking, from an evaluation and behavioral standpoint that they got wrong. And so that ended up being my thesis. And then the project was on a transportation issue in Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon's located. So that was the basis for a lot of what I ended up doing in my entire career. And it definitely drives a lot of what we do at Cultivated Insights, which is trying to understand the inputs, the outputs, understand what motivates or incentivizes human behavior. And then also the other big piece of this that I definitely want to mention is metrics really matter when they're connected to behavior. And so you always want to make sure that if you are measuring something, that it is being used as an honest mirror or as a diagnostic, right? Like it's meant to help create feedback loop that lets the participant learn about their own behavior and make adjustments. The thing that was problematic with No Child Left Behind and with other metrics that I've seen in evaluation that I've seen out there is that if you have something called goal displacement, in other words, if you're teaching to the test, if the goal is to get a high test score and not to actually measure critical learning skills and things of that nature, you end up having this goal displacement, which is just a fancy term for saying either cheating or people just don't engage with the metric and you're not measuring anything intelligent, right? So Albert Einstein's very famous for saying, not everything that is meaningful can be measured and not everything that is measured is meaningful. And so I think about that a lot when I'm designing evaluation.
I love that. And I love the metrics matter because you lead in beautifully to the next thing I wanted to talk about. I know you use as one of your assessment modalities, you like using the DISC, which is a great
Yeah.
measurement of personality.
Mm-hmm.
I use the Habit Finder assessment, which to me allows me to go one level deeper into behavior. So when you're looking at metrics and cultivating and looking at the insight and coming up to gain insight to come up with your playbook or kind of your assessment back to that C-suite leader and their team, what are some of the things that you see a repetitive behavior pattern for? And kind of part two of that question is, what are you noticing pre-COVID and during COVID?
I think I'll take the second question first, I guess. I think when I decided to launch the business and to do this, I think there was a couple of things that guided me. One was I'm just a nerd for learning, and I really think that it's important, again, with brain plasticity and problem solving and things like that, and internal motivation of every employee. You want to keep fostering that growth, and professional development and learning and development is just such a great investment because the employee feels seen and heard and supported, and then they're bringing that enthusiasm and energy back into the organization. But I felt that also sometimes workshops were not taken seriously because there wasn't any real evaluation attached to it. A lot of evaluation ends up being a referendum on the likability of the trainer, and that's completely useless. What we really want to understand is, how much have things, do we move the dial for the employee? And a lot of the reason too, I noticed I was getting booked to come and work with organizations when there was some sort of internal issue, like, leadership change, or maybe there's a set of layoffs, and HR kind of knows, okay, if something creates turbulence, well, let's just do an all hands and bring in a trainer and, teach interesting new skills or entertainment or whatever the case is. And so I really wanted to make sure, again, as a scientist, like, can we measure the effect of this intervention, the intervention being the workshop or the all hands or whatever, right? So I looked for an instrument and found a couple to guide the questions that I asked before and after the workshop, um, it, to gauge people's self-reported trust levels for various, groups of people in the organization. And I was able to actually measure and confirm what we might know intuitively, which is trust levels go up after you have a group activity. And I could measure it not only, to see that shift, but in almost all cases, it's actually statistically significant, that shift is. And that's important to me because that credibility is a big deal for me, and using metrics appropriately is a big deal for me. And a lot of the times employees will be way more honest with a third party because I never disaggregate the data for the client. So they feel they can be more honest with me. They don't have to lie to me. When organizations do kind of internal stuff, assessment and employee engagement stuff, I mean, they know who's taking that data, right? And so that might kind of create a little bit of introduce a little bit of bias, but that's also what I tell my clients is like, listen, we're going to do this thing and we're going to evaluate and see whether or not the employees are acquiring this new skill or new perspective. And then we'll also ask these other questions that you can use as validation points against your internal tracking. Which Deb, I feel like I went a little bit off topic there, but let me come back to what you asked about pre and post COVID, because I think that's a lot of people think about that right now, obviously. Pre-COVID, so I work kind of all over, frankly, all over the globe, but, would get booked out to do stuff anywhere outside of not just here in Texas, but Austin, of course, being a hub of the tech industry. There's just tons of work here. And what I noticed was that clients were booking me to come in and work with their staff because there was always this flight risk. In Austin before the pandemic, our unemployment rate was like 2.9% or something like that. I mean, it was just insane. If you had a heartbeat, someone would hire you. You know what I mean? It was very competitive, and employers and organizations were concerned with holding on to their staff. And now it's just a completely different ball game. And it's not for the reasons you would think. You know what I mean? It's not that people are necessarily, I mean, part of it I think is people aren't moving because the economy overall is constricting, but I think in times of crisis, we don't necessarily have an instinct to jump ship, so people kind of want to like hold on to those jobs. But what I've also realized from talking to folks and to clients is that people just have to learn a different way of working. You know what I mean? I'm sure you've heard the same thing. Your other podcast guests too have talked to this. You know what I mean? And so, and I'm actually about to roll out a set of new modules. I mean, most of the stuff I did before was, yes, it was on disc, mostly to help people. It wasn't so much about understanding themselves. It's a little bit, all of my assessments are about doing some self-assessment and self-awareness, but a majority of my time is actually taking these frameworks and helping people learn to apply them externally so that they can be adaptive to their colleagues and their coworkers and be supportive. And so now we're doing the same thing. It's not with an eye towards retention. It is actually an eye towards finding a new way to be functional, right? So 2 of the modules I'm developing, one is on stress styles to help people understand and be able to characterize certain behaviors and understand, oh, that's the stress style of my colleague, and this is what I can do to support them. And then the burnout stuff, I mean, there's tons of burnout indexes out there. The burnout index is actually guided somewhat by my own experience in burnout and chronic illness and then recovering to some level of remission. But I think helping people understand limits is now the new thing. I know that it helped me and it seems to be helping folks that I'm working with. But helping people understand, the phrase that I use is bright yellow lines, which is what I always would say. And then it ended up, now it's actually becoming like a thing. But the whole idea is on a road, if you stay between the bright yellow lines, you're going to be safe. And if the road is your life, you want to get down that road as far as possible. And depending on kind of where you might fall on the burnout index, if you're in stasis, if you're feeling great, like go off-road, you know what I mean? Like go and do whatever you want. But if you are at a stage where, you are burnt out or extremely burnt out, you have to, and again, it goes back to behavioral modification. You have to learn what are the limits, what are the bright yellow lines, and then how do we keep between those bright yellow lines.
Well, I want to thank you for being so open and vulnerable and honest, because the reason I left the disability case management world and transitioned into coaching wasn't because of the transferable skills. I was saddened by the lack of boundary management. I was saddened by the burnout and rapid increase in chronic illness, terminal diagnoses. I lost a few of my clients to cancer, and they told me at end of life that they knew it was related to the cultural toxicity that they were engaged in at work, because they looked at their life as a whole, which people do at the end of life. And I love that, number one, I love that you were able to get out of that scenario and heal, and you created that beautiful tool, which is now, helping lots of other people. But, a big proponent of my branding language is self-care. So
Yep.
boundary management it's necessary. And what I'm seeing through COVID-19 and the C-suite leaders and executive teams that I'm working with is they're seeing how fundamental it is for them to lead and model that behavior of self-care. And leads beautifully into my next question. What imperfection do you think you have or have demonstrated towards being a heart-centered leader?
Oh man. Again, in the spirit of deep transparency, I think because the environments that I worked in, I mean, I worked with military families, I worked in counterintelligence before I came to political work, and then I spent almost 20 years working in politics and elections. And I think that part of my survival and career success when I was doing that part of my career was becoming very objective and really pulling emotion totally out of it. I think it was helpful for me in some ways to always approach things as a scientist. I think it also was not. I mean, I am a woman of color who always looks way younger than I actually am, and so there was that kind of stuff that I was dealing with, and so I think my reaction to that, my way of navigating through my career and that part of my career was to never talk about emotion or appear vulnerable or soft, to be honest. And I really had an aversion to phrases like self-care. And that is an imperfection that I'm trying to evolve away from. And I think I've also I've realized, in my own work and also with, I interview executives all the time for Forbes. And I think there's this wonderful, important softening where you can't be dismissive of self-care, and we have to pay attention to it, because if we don't, I mean, then everything breaks down. So if the imperfection I really want to own is, I have been working on being more transparent and being an emotional creature, and helping people really embrace that, pay attention to it. And also, I think a lot of these assessments or models that I've come up with, um, I always, feedback's an interesting thing, right? And I've trained, hundreds of people from a variety of backgrounds, and I always pay attention to the feedback I get from a certain type of participant, and they're generally middle-aged white guys, and they tend to have uh, this response that is a little bit of a backhanded compliment, but it's an important proof point for me, because it means that the concepts and tactics I'm trying to get out there are landing, and people are being able to accept them and absorb them and use them. But anyhow, this has happened probably like half a dozen times with different types of audiences: white collar, tech companies. I have a couple of state agencies, and the response from this particular type of participant is sometimes they'll do it in front of the whole group. A lot of times it's afterwards, and they'll just come up and say, what, I thought when I found out you were going to talk about personality or stress styles, I really thought, this is a bunch of hooey, and I almost walked out, but I'm glad I stayed because I think I learned something. And I think you might have helped me figure out something with my wife. And I always laugh, because it's like, okay, good. It's had a breakthrough moment, and these are the type of people that they're not thinking about self-care. They might have an aversion to self-care, and they need it the most, right?
Well, it opens up a beautiful conversation for me to talk about metacognition.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, we're going to talk about how you think about thinking. And, I get the glazed look, and it's funny, but when you break down the science and layman's terms they get it. And it's that aha moment for me. And I usually, like you say, it's the softening, and I usually have a good laugh, and I get, well, of course I do that. And I'm like, common sense isn't always common practice. Let's go back and be truthful and authentic here. And when you do call them on the behavior, it's always followed up by a strategy, and again, behavioral modification. So it's the hamster wheel, but it's almost like relinquishing the repetitive pattern of behavior. And once they see it
Yes.
by an outside set of eyes, that's when the light goes off. So just so much synergy in the work we do. So I want to end with what I call my Fab Four.
Okay.
So these are the fun 4 questions that I get to ask you. And these are the non-thinking. It's like, what is just on the top of your mind and comes to. So if you could interview or sit with someone, whether they're living or have passed away, who would it be and why?
Oh man. There are so many people that I think the first one that's top of mind for me is Ida B. Wells. I think that the United States and frankly the world is at a very interesting turning point. It would be really, and she was, you know, an incredible journalist and leader and activist. And I would want to sit with her and ask her what she was thinking when she was doing the difficult work that she was doing. Because I mean, here's the thing, right? Like people get defensive because they're protective of a set of world beliefs that they might have. And I think that one thing a lot of folks, maybe all of us, are struggling with right now is, you know, and I use that example of like personality with, you know, a certain people that, you know, there's this idea around white masculinity and what that should look like. And you can't kind of go after it directly, but you can say, well, can we introduce a new framework that lets you adjust your perspective? Um, and I think we live in a time where we're able to have those conversations, even if they're difficult. And Ida B. Wells was extraordinary, and you know, a Black journalist at a time, you know, 100 years ago, where she was exposing things and making people really reckon with how they, you know, constructed their identity or things of that nature. It would just be wonderful to be able to sit at her feet and listen and learn from her.
That's an exciting one.
Yeah.
If I went to your friends and your family
Uh-oh.
and I asked them to describe Tanya in one word, what would that word be?
Probably fiery, which I'm not crazy about, but it's accurate.
Well, fiery is a good thing, and I think it's synonymous with grit and tenacity. So that's a good word. Now,
Yeah.
going back to self-care, my third question is: you have survived burnout and a chronic illness, and learned a lot along the way. What is one of your favorite daily practices for self-care?
I've done a lot of calisthenics and stretching. I think that has been really useful in the morning. The other thing is, so when I got finally to a point, I got really sick in 2013. I think there was stuff kind of going on before then, but 2013 was when it really came to a head. And then it was basically 2.5 years of just resetting everything. And one of the things I couldn't do, according to my doctor, was any sort of rigorous sports. So when I finally got the green light in late 2015, I went out and signed up for the most aggressive sport I could find, which was Krav Maga. I don't know it, because I am a fiery person and I'm called various things. I loved being in the studio and in gyms because I was never the most fiery person in the room. All of a sudden, like, you know, I was being praised by people for my aggression on the mat, which I find hilarious. But because I'm really not a very good athlete, I'm more of a mathlete than an athlete. You know what I mean? So the other self care though that I've done, you know, everything's closed right now, but I do have a wave bag, which is like a heavy bag, but it's on a stand in my backyard. So I try every few days to go outside and work on various drills and punching drills and kicking drills. There's this phrase that people say that, you know, don't forget to breathe, and it always kind of drives me a little bananas. Breathing is involuntary, but so I try to tell people, like, don't forget to yell. Like, it's very cleansing to yell. It's very good for your core muscles. But and that's the other reason why I think I ended up, you know, it's been 4.5 years now of 4.5 years in my late 30s, early 40s. I would not suggest this. Like, if you're interested in martial arts, do it as early as possible. But I have found it incredibly. That's my form of self care. It is very aggressive, but um,
But it's
it's just,
but it's personal. It has
yeah.
self-care has to be what's personal to you. And I'm gonna follow up on the breathing point and say I'm a yoga teacher and breathing is important. So you and I will have another conversation around that.
Oh, yes, please.
My fourth question is, what do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, great question. Oh man. Um, About a month in from the pandemic, I was sitting at my dining room table and I looked at the shelf uh, of a bunch of books that I have. And there's this one shelf I have. It's all of my negotiation and leadership books. Well, one shelf of many. We have a lot of books in this house. Anyhow, but I was sitting there and I was looking at these books that are considered negotiation canon. And I realized, and I think this goes back to heart-centered leadership, like I realized that so much of negotiation has been built on this a very specific type of power. It's been built around the idea of competition. We use words like leverage, right? And that's force. And I just had this moment where I was like, everything's got to be rewritten. Everything's got to be rewritten, and I have a couple of books in the works, and sometimes I lose motivation, but that really kind of struck home to me that my legacy is I want to leave behind some really useful books that will be relevant in 5 years and 10 years, and maybe even if I'm lucky in 100 years, that someone would come and pick up the book and read it, and that they would learn a set of skills that help them become more of who they truly are, first of all, right? Authenticity being so important, but also understanding that power is not only about force. Power is about being magnetic, right? It's about bringing people together. It's about understanding problem solving as a way of bringing in perspective and being inclusive. And again, cultivating, right? Cultivating a vision, but also that it's expansive, So when people say, oh, well, they have good leverage in that negotiation, I say, I try to help them evolve their thinking and say, well, is it leverage, or are they acting as a magnet, right? Drawing people towards you because you have such an interesting idea or a solution is a much more gentle and I think powerful approach than having every time I hear the word leverage, I think crowbar. You know what I mean? And like, you don't just have to have a crowbar, you could have a magnet, right? And think about all the different ways that the natural world also teaches us about power. Hierarchies are actually very vulnerable to disease or threat, right? If you have a hierarchy, if you have power built off of a hierarchy, then you take out the top and the whole system fails, like an ecosystem. But if the ecosystem's built off of the idea of a web where there's space for everybody, there's reciprocity, there's synergy, then that's a much more resilient model. And it's also one that is where I feel most comfortable. And so I hope my legacy is I help people redefine power and do it in such a way where we're really following what has heart and meaning and not just thinking about competition. Competition had its time, and I feel like collaboration is necessary and useful right now. So I hope that's my legacy, that I leave behind some blueprints.
Well, and I think with your fiery personality and your leadership in reading and knowledge and what you bring, I think you'll succeed doing that. Tanya, I'm so thrilled to have spent this time with you today. I want to thank you for being on the Imperfect podcast. I look forward to continued conversations and grateful to LinkedIn that our paths cross. And I know there's some synergy and this won't be our last conversation.
I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you, Deb.
My pleasure. So I'm going to end the podcast with my favorite 5 things, and that's to follow your heart, have passion, do your best, know your truth, and always be in love with the journey. This is Deb Crow. Thanks for joining me on Imperfect, the Heart-Centered Leadership Podcast.